Good evening and welcome to the Northwestern Michigan College International Affairs Forum. My name is Jim Bensley and I'm the director of IAF. I want you to know that tonight's presentation with Jeff Rathke has changed a bit since we first asked him to join us last fall. Originally, he had planned on providing an in-depth, very focused discussion on the rise of populism in Germany, which he still will cover. However, since unfortunately the world is now a much different place than it was on February 23rd, and because Germany is such an important player in the EU's efforts to punish Russia's continued advance into Ukraine, Jeff has offered to add an additional focus on Germany's role in hopefully bringing that crisis to an end. We look forward to the conversation. And as always, we'll offer you a chance to ask Jeff questions following his initial conversation with John. Please enter the questions you have in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin our program, I just also want to mention that there is a link in the chat that our team will put up that does help support the Elk Rapids Academic World Quest Championship team and their travel to Washington, D.C. to compete in the national competition at the end of April. So if you are inclined, please check it out. And now let me introduce our moderator and speaker for this evening's presentation. Dr. John Zachman is a professor in the political science and philosophy departments at Northwestern Michigan College. He teaches moral and ethical philosophy and political science courses in a variety of disciplines and has been promoting student and community engagement in world affairs for over 2 decades at NMC. John holds a Bachelor of Arts from Michigan State University and a Master's of Arts and Ph.D. from Duke University. Jeff Rathke is president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining AICGS, Jeff was a senior fellow and deputy director of the Europe program at CSIS, where his work focused on transatlantic relations and U.S. security and defense policy. Jeff joined CSIS in 2015 from the State Department after a 24-year career as a Foreign Service officer, dedicated primarily to U.S. relations with Europe. He was director of the State Department Press Office from 2014 to 2015. Jeff led the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur from 2011 to 2014. Prior to that, he was Deputy Chief of Staff to the NATO Secretary General in Brussels. He also served in Berlin as Minister Counselor for Political Affairs from 2006 to 2009, his second tour of duty in Germany. His Washington assignments have included Deputy Director of the Office of European Security and Political Affairs and Duty Officer in the White House Situation Room and State Department Operations Center. Mr. Rathke was a Weinberg Fellow at Princeton University, winning the Masters in Public Policy Prize. He also served at U.S. embassies in Dublin, Moscow, and Riga, which he helped open after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mr. Rathke has been awarded national honors by Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as several State Department awards. He holds a Master in Public Policy degree from Princeton University and a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell. Jeff speaks German, Russian, and Latvian. Welcome, John and Jeff.
Thank you so much, Jim. And welcome, Jeff. It's so nice to have you here today.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure.
Well, we are limited on time because I know an hour is going to go by more quickly than we think it will. So I'm going to jump right into things. I think we'll start with the Russian military invasion of Ukraine. Of course, it's on all of our minds. And this invasion seems to have sparked something of a change in Germany's foreign policy. We see a Germany acting today that is somewhat different than we have over the last several decades. So I want to begin with that question. What changes do you see in terms of Germany's approach to its foreign policy today that we maybe were not seeing in the past?
Yeah, well, John, it's been remarkable. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed so much in international politics in just a few weeks. And you see it in Germany as well. What has happened over the last few weeks has been a real turning point in Germany's foreign policy, and especially in their security and defense policy. What this means in practical terms is that a country that has been focused since the end of the Cold War on maximizing the potential for dialogue with Russia, at promoting a new kind of relationship, both economic as well as political, and that has really tried to avoid the hard questions of defense and security, has had to reorient their strategy. And that's what's happened since February 24th. And most dramatically, 3 days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz made a declaration at an extraordinary session of the German Bundestag parliament, in which he committed Germany to doing a number of things that it had been reluctant to do. The first was committing Germany to spend 2% of its GDP on defense beginning this year and then moving forward. That's something that the United States and other NATO allies had been calling on Germany to do for a long time, but Germany was very reluctant about that for reasons we may get into in the discussion. The Chancellor also announced that Germany would establish a special defense fund of 100 billion euros. That's about $110 billion at today's exchange rate, which would be used to support the long-term procurement and outfitting of Germany's armed forces. And in addition to that, Germany was instrumental in creating the massive sanctions package on Russia, which was implemented in the days right around the start of the war. So this is a huge change for Germany, and one that they're still trying to digest, I would say.
Is the historical reluctance of Germany to be, I guess, assertive in these ways, is that really a carryover from World War II, where that, ever since 1945, we've really seen a Germany that has wanted to, I guess, not play that role. It has been hesitant, and obviously we've seen it only, we've only had a unified Germany for about 3 decades now. And so do you feel like this is the turning point where, in 2-3 decades from now, we're going to be looking back at 2022 as the year that Germany started a new role that really that will come to define Germany in the future?
So you're right, John, to orient this German approach in the aftermath of World War II. There are certain characteristics that you can see in continuity throughout that period. And the first thing is that as the former German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer once put it, not only was one part of the German approach never again, in other words, never again war, Holocaust, and Germany being responsible for the destruction of Europe, but also never alone. That one of the lessons that is deeply embedded in German society and in its politics is that German unilateralism was something to be guarded against. And so it is why Germany has so deeply integrated itself in Europe and been a promoter of the European Union's further integration, and why Germany's defense, for example, is basically entirely constituted within the framework of NATO. Some exceptions, but basically that is, Germany doesn't have national defense. It doesn't have national defense forces. The German Bundeswehr is integrated into NATO. So that's a consistent line. I think that what Germany has come around to now will make it a leader in ways that will be obvious, because Germany will be the largest defense budget in all of Europe, if indeed it starts spending 2% of its GDP on defense. Now, maybe others will increase and catch up to them, but that would put Germany ahead of the current level of British defense spending, for example. It's already ahead of France in terms of its annual defense budget. And so this is going to be a change. Germany will play a leading role in a lot of the defense industrial efforts. But I think one thing won't change, and that is Germany is going to remain embedded in European and transatlantic structures. That is too deeply rooted in German politics and society for that to change. And I think in many ways, the lesson that Germany is drawing from, again, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and attempt to remake the European security order is to reinvest in that multilateral and pluralistic order.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, we're going to see a Germany that's more assertive through these multinational institutions, NATO, potentially as well as the EU, probably more on a diplomatic front, I would imagine. Can you, just to give some perspective here, the United States, we spend a little less than 4% of our GDP on defense. If Germany is going to be around 2%, roughly, are we looking at $100 billion in defense spending, or 50 billion yearly for Germany?
So it's a little bit less than 100, and it also depends. Currency fluctuations can make these values change significantly. But right now, Germany's annual defense spending is right around 50 billion euros. Exchange rates, that's around $55 billion. So that is about 1.5% of GDP. So to go to 2% would bring Germany to around $70 billion. And so what we're talking about is an increase of somewhere around 20 billion, give or take, and that's going to be hugely significant. Although you're right, it is significantly less than the United States defense budget, which is north of 700 billion. Although the United States has global security responsibilities that are quite different from those Germany has taken on. Right,
right. Let's move more directly towards, I guess, Ukraine and Russia here. Can you offer us something of a kind of a German perspective? And let me, I guess, frame this. Of course, Germany, very different from the United States, Russia's a major trading partner for them. They have a lot of trade, especially in terms of energy. But yeah, I was looking at the numbers today, and I think it was something like 59% of Russian imports into Germany are energy. That still leaves in the ballpark of 40%, give or take, that's non-energy related. And then, of course, it also exports a lot to Russia. So there's a major difference there, because in the United States, we can ban Russian oil, but that's maybe 5% of our imported oil or something like that. It's not, for the Germans, this is a different story. This is it's a much bigger deal in many ways to deal with Russia in these ways. So can you give us something of a German perspective on what this crisis means? And especially because 2014, we had the Crimean Peninsula, and I don't want to say a similar dynamic because the scale of that was so different, but yeah, there was some similarities in that dynamic, and we did not see a huge change in terms of Germany's policy towards Russia. And then now I think we are. So what might you tell us in terms of just kind of how Germany is looking at this crisis?
Yeah. That's a great point. And I'll start with the second one, and that is the German reaction to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the Russian intervention in the Donbass area in 2014. You're right that the German and the overall Western reaction was not nearly as comprehensive as it's been this time, and not nearly as quick either, I'd add. But there were some effects that we can easily identify. And the first was, that was the first wave of German reinvestment in defense. Germany's defense budget in 2014 was 35 billion, about 35 billion euros. Today it's 50. So you've had an increase of German defense spending of about 50%. Compared to 2014. So there's you can argue, and many have, that Germany was dramatically underspending in 2014. It had cashed in too much of a peace dividend during the Cold War. But nevertheless, however you want to characterize the 2014 baseline, since then, defense spending has gone up quite significantly. Now, the other aspect that you touched on is the economic relationship. Germany does have a huge economic relationship with Russia. It is the fifth most important trading partner outside the European Union. But that phrase outside the European Union is crucial because most of Germany's economic relationships are still inside the European Union. And so when you look at Russia's proportion of overall German trade, it's actually relatively small. It's 2.3%. But it becomes more significant when you look at the individual sectors, and energy is the most important one. Germany gets 55% of its natural gas from Russia. It gets about 35% of its oil from Russia. And interestingly, this gets less attention, but it gets 50% of its coal from Russia as well. So the energy relationship is the largest single component of German imports from Russia. And a large part of the remaining imports are also natural resources, or they are partially, partially processed resources that are then imported to Germany and then finished. So it is the lion's share, and that's why the question of whether Germany would, unilaterally and kind of proactively curtail its energy imports from Russia is so significant. It's significant because it would hurt the Russian economy even more than the sanctions already have. But it would also be very difficult for Germany economically to deal with, and that's what they're grappling with right now: is what they can do, how quickly can they do it, and if they take steps to diminish or cut off certain energy imports, can they sustain that? I think that's one of the major concerns Germany has right now, is not to make promises they can't keep. And that's, I think one way they look at this demand from, among others, Ukrainian President Zelensky, who addressed a session of the German Bundestag today by video, the same way he's been talking to the US Congress and to other NATO member state legislatures over the last few days.
And of course, as winter eases up here, they'll be in something of a better position, I assume, in terms of the natural gas front. But I'm going to make the assumption that their electrical generation is largely dependent upon the natural gas and coal from Russia.
That's right. Well, that's right. There's a significant portion of renewable energy that Germany already has, but under the government of Olaf Scholz, which took office just in December, so not very long ago, they have a really ambitious plan to expand renewables even further. So I would put that into the mix.
Right, and that may be so a long-term takeaway here, maybe a kind of even more vigorous commitment on the part of the Germans to use renewables and to become, in that way, a little bit more energy independent from Russia moving forward.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this crisis has made energy a national security issue in Germany in ways that it has not been perceived up to now. Now, there's a lot of frustration that goes with that, because I can certainly tell you from my time as an American diplomat that we were often telling Germany that there were risks involved in the close energy partnership, the energy dependency that they were building with Russia. The United States wasn't alone in that view. Poland, many other Eastern and Central European countries, Germany's partners in the European Union, in NATO, even some of the countries in some of the Nordic countries, also quite skeptical about the way Germany was building its relationship with Russia, that it had serious risks. So that is something that Germany is now coming around to recognize. And you can say it's a decade or two late, but regardless, they are reaching that conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it reminds me of a story, and maybe you can confirm this story. So because I don't have a source on this, but so the story I have in my mind is that Angela Merkel met with Putin. And in one, I think that maybe Putin was in Germany and was speaking German, I think to the Bundestag, and that wasn't impressive to Merkel because she knew well why he spoke perfect German, and that history there with the KGB. But then the story I'm thinking of is that Merkel sat down with Putin, and that she had a phobia, or has a phobia, of dogs. And that Putin had two very large dogs in the room purposefully to intimidate Angela Merkel. And I raise that story because in many ways, and this isn't, what I'm getting at here, I think is a point that I would make for all liberal democracies in the world to really kind of consider, is that Putin hasn't changed. Putin's been the same this whole time. And yet, and I say this knowing that in my international relations class just several weeks before the invasion, several weeks ago, I said, I don't think that Russia's going to invade. So I'm saying this not as somebody who's off the hook in any way. But it seems to me that Putin has been consistent, and that yet now with this happening in Ukraine, I'm hoping this is a new day, but I'm also, I guess, suggesting a little bit that, is it possible? I mean, is this really going to be a fracturing in the relationship with Germany and Russia, and for that matter, with other trading partners with Russia? Or is there some way that we see this resolve itself where where it's not a major shift? And then let me get to that, and then I have, of course, more.
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I think that for Germany is a consensus political system. The variations in political views notwithstanding, it is a political system that has four significant, quite mainstream parties that have a high degree of overlap, and I think what you see over the last couple of months, especially as the Russian troop buildup around Ukraine and in Belarus took place, and now that this brutal, all-encompassing war has been unleashed, is that it has basically obliterated whether you want to call them illusions or just hopes that people in Germany had about the ability to construct an amicable future with Russia, have really been wiped away. And I don't think that is going to change much, even if Vladimir Putin tomorrow decided that he was going to withdraw all of his forces from Ukraine and try to go back to the status quo ante. I think that this has kind of removed the scales from everyone's eyes, and there's not going to be a reversion back to the way things were. There will, of course, be people who will, still want to have a relationship with Russia. Many Germans see that as, in some ways, an obligation for Germany, having unleashed the Second World War, of which the Soviet Union was the greatest victim. That it is incumbent on Germany to go the extra mile for peace and dialogue. So that tendency is always going to be there, but I just don't see that there's any real going back to creating the kind of interdependence, especially economic interdependence, that was kind of an assumption among all of the political forces in Germany until just a couple of weeks ago.
Right. So a line has been crossed, in other words, that is a game changer, excuse me, a game changer insofar as is the way that Germans will look at the Russian leadership and Russia as a country.
And John, sorry to interrupt
go
you there,
ahead.
but there's one additional thought that I want to add to it before we move on to the next topic on your mind, and that is that this is not just about the kind of geopolitical considerations and the security considerations. It's also because Germany as a society, and especially the current government, has placed a high emphasis on energy transition. And that is to move away from to be completely carbon neutral by 2045. That was the aspiration before this war began. I think we can expect that target to be accelerated in meaningful ways, and so that is, by its own nature, that has its own dynamic, which is going to diminish Germany's reliance on Russia. Because within less than 2 decades, their plan is to be using no oil, no gas, no coal, and so there's a way in which the energy and climate goals of this government have now become national security. They have a national security overlay, and as well as the revulsion of German society at this war, in which has already generated the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me, it's very interesting to think that kind of the same thing that maybe made Germany cautious as a country in terms of its own foreign policy post-World War II is the same thing that makes Russia's actions right now so abhorrent to it. Right? Because what it's seen from Russia kind of harkens back to its own. And, we hear that, of course, on the news as we, the refugee crisis right now in Europe is the biggest we've seen since World War II. And, and this invasion is really kind of unprecedented in the post-war period. Being conscious of time and the fact that we do also want to talk a little bit about the elections of 2021, the fact that, well, one, this ties into, of course, the coalition government we have under Scholz, where the Greens are a part of that. We have the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Freedom Party in a first here in this term, in terms of this coalition. I'd be interested in terms of one, on how that fits into the equation. Certainly, it seems like on the energy front, that's relevant with the Green Party and also just the Christian Democrats being the more conservative of the German parties. But then I also want to transition a bit to populism here and how, I guess, German political culture, a sense of German nationalism may fit into this. And certainly, the 2021 election being, well, not a victory for the alternative for Germany. They lost vote share and seat share, I believe, in terms of the Bundestag. So that's a lot to throw at you. So take it in whatever order you want. But let's start to talk about German politics.
Absolutely. I think the election in the fall of 2021 has a few big takeaways. And the first one is, of course, that the center-right Christian Democrats, CDU and CSU, the Bavarian version of it, they lost dramatically in their vote share. And so, after Angela Merkel had been chancellor for 16 years, all of a sudden you've got a different government. So that's the big story. A few other stories go along with that, though. One is that all of the two big parties, which were the center-right Christian Democrats and the center-left Social Democrats, have experienced declining vote shares over the years. So in this case, the Social Democrats finished first in the election, but they finished first with only 25% of the vote, 25 and change. And so that's something that is unusual. And so there's an ongoing fragmentation of the vote in Germany. And at the same time that the center right and center left have lost, you had the Green Party with a significant increase in their votes. They got about 15%. much higher than they had ever won before. And the liberal Free Democratic Party also finished above 10%. So you've got an emerging, not quite parity, but no longer the same kind of dominance that you used to have, where there would be one clear senior partner and one clear junior partner in a coalition. It's become a much more complicated challenge to put together a government. And that's why you've got a government now which is made up of three parties: the Social Democrats, the Greens, finished in, which are the second largest party in the government, and then the Free Democrats. And that means that, you know, all the compromises that go into governing have become more complicated. You know, you might say they're 50% more complicated because you've got, you know, three instead of two parties. But also a word on populism. You're right. The far right Alternative for Germany party, the AfD, they did worse, significantly worse. They got about 10% of the vote. They were sort of the big surprise of the 2017 election, where they entered the Bundestag for the first time, and through a quirk of fate, they were sort of the largest opposition party. That's no longer the case. The other thing that I would highlight is that you've got a kind of far left party in Germany as well, called Die Linke, the left. And they are not extreme in the way that the AfD is on the right, but they are nevertheless a sort of left populist party in some ways. And they suffered an even bigger loss in this election. They finished just under 5%. So if you want to add up all of the extreme votes on the far left and on the extreme right, that's around 15% of the German electorate, which is lower than it had been in previous in the 2017 election. So there's a shift going on among populist forces in Germany at the same time that the mainstream parties are becoming a bit more fragmented in their support.
Very interesting. So, I mean, so it sounds like you have more parties in the middle, more fragmented, but ultimately voters are moving towards the middle insofar as they're moving away from the radical parties on the left and the right. With that said, the alternative for Germany, the populist right-wing party, still has 80 seats out of 736 in the Bundestag, with 10% of the vote in 2021. You know, it's interesting to me, of course, here in the United States with the two-party system, to look at populism within the Republican Party and how that manifests itself. You know, is that diminishing? Is it not diminishing? You know, 2022 will give us some idea of that with the election this coming November. But it strikes me that the multi-party system in Germany has an advantage in that it takes a populist, populist voters, and they can target the AfD in Germany, as opposed to the Christian Democrats have been able to kind of fend off populism. So with those comments in mind, I'm interested in your take on populism in Germany as compared to, let's say, populism in the United States. Do you see some substantial differences? Do you see some similarities, whether it be in what's kind of pushing Germans who are drawn to populism, what's pushing them in that direction? Comments there.
Yeah. I'll hesitate to draw some comparisons to the United States because I'm not, you know, my area of principal professional focus is not the US political system, but of course I'm an American citizen, I live in Washington, you can't really avoid it. But if I look at the AfD and the way, you know, it's a party that has changed in many ways since it first emerged on the national scene around 10 years ago, a little bit less than 10 years ago. At first, it was a kind of anti-Euro, anti-Eurozone, anti-bailout party, mostly economically driven. It became then an anti-immigrant party, especially after the big refugee spike in 2015 and 2016. And that's what really brought them into the Bundestag in 2017. they have become, I would say, a more extreme party over the last 4 years. And they have lost a number of their more, I hesitate to call them moderate, but basically there are a number of their leaders who have either been forced out or who have voluntarily left the party because it was becoming less flexible, more extreme, and the more extreme voices within the party have grown in significance and are now kind of setting the direction of the party at the national level. So I think that is, you have this phenomenon, which is probably not unusual, where you have an extreme movement that becomes more extreme, that even as its popular appeal diminishes, the dynamic within the party is still to propel it further to the extremes. And that's what we see with the AFD. If you think back to 2017, let's say, there were a lot of people who voted for the AFD, not necessarily because they supported extreme politics, but because maybe they felt Merkel had not dealt appropriately with the refugee crisis, or maybe they had concerns about the Eurozone and the stability within the Eurozone, and Germany's policies toward the common currency. Those were people who were still, maybe marginal mainstream voters, but who, had this sort of fundamental disagreement. Now, if you look at the people who are driving the positions of the AFD and the types of votes they are catering to, it's quite different. They're not trying to pick up marginal, people who may be at the fringes of the center right to appeal to them. No, this is much more about issues where I think it's fair to use the word extreme, and so that's a change. Of course, Germany has a parliamentary system, so as long as you can get 5% of the vote, you are represented in the parliament. And it's of course a different dynamic in the United States, where you in order to cross that threshold, you either need to take over a party from the inside, or you need to create a third party that can get a plurality of votes in an election, which is extremely hard and has rarely happened in American history. So you have different thresholds for playing a nationally prominent role, and so I think what you see happening on the in German populism is more about consolidating their hold over a small party that is going to remain small. Whereas in the United States, it's a bit different. It's an attempt, I think, to sort of take over and set the direction of one of our two main parties.
Does the AFD, do they win in any of the single member districts in the elections, or is there 10% really just through the proportional second vote that the voters in Germany cast?
They've won a couple of direct seats, and there's a related point there that you touch on, which I'm glad you mentioned, and that is the AFD. It's in the Eastern German states, the states that used to make up the East Germany. That's where the AFD's support is the strongest. Now, those states are relatively small in population. So if you added up the total number of votes that the AFD gets in Germany, they still get more votes in Western Germany than they do in Eastern Germany. But the AFD dominates is the wrong word. Let me take that back. The AFD has a disproportionate impact on politics in the Eastern German states. And it is trying to turn itself into, and this goes hand in hand with the movement toward the extremes that I mentioned earlier, because that's where most of the most extreme views in the AFD are politicians who are based in Eastern Germany. So now they win somewhere between 20 and 25% in state elections in Eastern Germany, which means that they have the ability to influence, and in some cases even to paralyze politics in those states. Even though they don't have a majority, they have a large enough minority that they make it very hard for very hard for other parties to form governments and to govern effectively, which of course is a classic populist move. What they want to do is make the system ineffective through their actions. And then when the system is ineffective, they blame the system still further and present themselves as the solution to this problem that they've helped to create. And so you see that dynamic having a much greater prospect of some kind of medium-term electoral, I don't want to call it success because I don't think they're going to win a majority anywhere and nobody will govern with them, but that they can build their vote share in those means in Eastern Germany in ways that just don't work in Western Germany. So that's an important characteristic also of this populism. It's not uniformly distributed across the country. It varies quite substantially.
You know, it seems to me, and I think this will probably have to be my last question because I know we're going to transition to Jim drawing on some questions that the audience has posed to us. But it seems to me that the conflict with Russia may offer Germany a chance to kind of reinvigorate a certain political identity or national identity that is relevant as we think of populism, because it seems that populism is largely drawn by identity politics and a desire to establish maybe a more meaningful or more traditional identity. And that in asserting itself in the current conflict with Russia, is this something where Germany has a path moving forward in terms of defining itself that's relevant to to populism in Germany? In other words, that Germany and Germans can reflect on what they want to be moving forward in a positive way, in an active way, and in a more assertive way that would be relevant to the draw of populism?
Well, there's one aspect that jumps out at me, and that is, I think this war in Ukraine, it is a reminder to Germans of the fundamental principles of German security and Germany's international position since 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was founded. And that is that Germany has to have its foreign and security policy embedded in international structures that make it impossible for Germany to go it alone, to present the kind of challenge and to international politics that had been the case from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. And so I think in that regard, it means that today, as compared to a month ago, somebody offering a German national solution to a German voter has substantially less appeal than he or she would have earlier. So that's always been the case for Germany's security, which is completely embedded in NATO. But it's true as well for other things. And I don't think so. I think this Russia's attack on the European security order is a reminder to all Germans of how much they depend on their international connectedness in the European Union, in NATO, with the United States, and more generally. So I think that is the biggest impact I would see. The others may exist as well, but I don't think they're going to come to the fore quite as quickly and in as direct a way.
Excellent. So international institutions matter, and this reaffirms that. So, well, with that said, let me see if Jim Bensley has some questions from the audience to pose.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Jeff. Very interesting conversation. I found myself sort of just glued to what you two were saying, because I don't know much about the German sort of standpoint. So thank you again for that. But let's get to the question. So we have one from Michael. And he says, when and why did Germany become so dependent on Russian energy?
Well, when Germany began importing, there was a project back in the 1970s already to build a pipeline to bring oil from the Soviet Union to then West Germany. Some viewers may recall this. It was the United States didn't like it at the time. And it even got to the point where early in the Reagan administration, there was a movement in the United States to sanction West Germany for carrying through this project. So eventually the United States backed off that position, and the pipeline was built. And so it's been 40 some years that Germany has been purchasing energy from the Soviet Union. Now, Germany wasn't alone. Other Western European countries were also buying energy. But what has changed? Two things. With the end of the Cold War, there was a desire to build a more normal economic relationship in Europe, and so Russia as a supplier of energy, and throughout the 1990s, there was very little hint of the possibility of Russia, going to war with its European neighbors. So that was the first change, I think. And then in the 2000s and in the 2010s is when the gas pipeline, the so-called Nord Stream 1, which was the first one built to bring Russian gas directly to Germany through the Baltic Sea pipeline, rather than going through Poland or through Ukraine, which is the way the original pipelines were built. That was a combination of things. First, it was an attempt to, many Germans looked at the economic ties with the Soviet Union during the Cold War as a source of some stability. It meant that both Germany and the Soviet Union had a stake in the relationship. And because the Soviet Union was economically relatively weak vis-a-vis the West, there was a calculation that the Soviet Union would never cut off the oil, or later the gas, because they needed the money. And they needed the money more than Germany needed the oil and the gas. What I think changed, and where I think Germany has been slow to react to this change, is that, especially since the 2014 Russian attack on Ukraine, President Putin has carried out a policy which has clearly been designed to do two things. One is to give Russia the option to sell gas to Europe without that gas going through Ukraine. And then the second is to build up Russia's reserves of foreign currency and minimize its own debt so that it would be in a position to withstand whatever might come, whether that would be sanctions or other economic measures. So this equilibrium that existed during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union needed the money just as much as Germany needed the oil and gas, that was no longer in the same balance that it was. And so I think that is the other reason that Germany was able to go this far in its dependence on Russia for energy.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Jeff, we have a question from Lee, and I hope it's not a loaded question, but I'm going to tee it up for you anyway. He says, what would be your advice to President Biden with respect to how best to engage with Germany in regards to the changed situation and with respect to Russia and respect to NATO's position in Europe? So I guess, asking, okay, how best to engage with Germany and also NATO would probably be the key components of that question.
No, I think it's a good question. I think First, I would say, I think the Biden administration has handled the situation with Germany pretty well since they came into office. Some viewers may remember last summer, 2021, Chancellor Merkel made her last visit to Washington, and the United States and Germany shortly thereafter reached an agreement, basically an understanding that on European energy security. And it was basically a two-part deal. Germany committed that if Russia ever tried to use energy as a weapon or to threaten Ukraine, that Germany would take serious measures in response to that. And then the other part of the deal was that the Biden administration would not put sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. These sanctions had been passed by Congress, and there was a lot of pressure from Congress to put as many sanctions as possible on it. Congress had even tried to pass further legislation that would make them mandatory. The Biden administration resisted that because I think their fundamental judgment, and I think that judgment was right, was that if Germany was going to sustainably cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which it has done in the last few weeks, that would have to be a German decision. That if it was forced on them by US legislation, that would generate a backlash. It would make it very hard for Germany to take that position and to sustain it for the long term. And I think the Biden approach has been vindicated because as soon as the Russian invasion happened, in fact, it was almost, I think it was that same week, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was basically deep-sixed. So that's the first thing. The second thing, when it comes to NATO, I think going back to the point about Germany embedded in relationships, supportive relationships with its neighbors. I think that what Germany should be doing as it increases its military capabilities and rebuilds the Bundeswehr, it should include the presence of German forces in other NATO member states to help bolster and deter Russia from any kind of aggression against NATO. I think that would be extremely reassuring, the same way that the United States has troops forward in places like the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania. I think the more Germany is ready to take those kinds of, to take risks, to put its own troops at risk as part of the broader effort for NATO to deter Russian aggression, I think that would be a very powerful move, because it would reassure countries that are most vulnerable to Russian pressure that the United States and also, the biggest economy, the biggest country in Europe also have their back. So I think that more than any, we could talk about individual weapon systems and how they should spend all this money they're going to be spending. That's important. But I think Germany making these gestures and having their presence along the eastern flank of NATO, it would be extremely important.
It's very insightful. Thank you for that one. Let's go to a question from Marcia. She asked, kind of moving back into the political spectrum here, could you explain the character of the German Freedom Party and how does it fit into the political picture in Germany?
Sure. So the first thing I would say, depending on how much certain viewers may be familiar with the Austrian Freedom Party, the first thing I would say is this is not the Austrian Freedom Party. This is the party is the Free Democratic Party. It is an economically liberal, also socially liberal party. So it is a party that has been part of the mainstream in Germany for a long time. They have a lot of support among small and medium-sized enterprises. They are typically in favor of lower taxes, lower debureaucratization, but they are also a socially liberal party. And they are, in the current government, they are in some ways kind of the fiscally prudent balance to the Social Democrats and the Greens, which have greater desire or greater readiness to incur debt, to spend on high priority social and other projects. So they are in some ways a kind of fiscally conservative counterbalance within this current coalition. That leads to some tensions within that government, but thus far, at least, they've kept those pretty well balanced. The finance minister, a gentleman named Christian Lindner, is he's the leader of the FDP. And as the finance minister, it's one of the most powerful positions in the German government, and he is in some ways in that position responsible for the fiscal prudence of the German government, and so that's one of the things that's most important to the Free Democratic Party, the FDP, and their voters.
Okay, thank you on that one. So we just have time for maybe one or two more, but I'm going to ask a question that Tom posed early in the conversation. And he states, Germany has not been a significant leader in NATO affairs and the ongoing transition following the Cold War. But do you see this as an opportunity for Germany to take on a more significant role in the post-Russian Ukraine war world of NATO and European security?
Well, I might gently disagree a little bit with the premise of the question. I think Germany has been a leader within NATO. You could argue that they have punched below their weight, and that they have not spent as much money as they should have on defense, and I mean that's a legitimate argument. But I think Germany has been a crucial part of the NATO approach to the post-Cold War political and security landscape in Europe. I mean, NATO enlargement was driven in a significant way in the 1990s by Germany. It was one of the first countries to support admitting new members into the alliance. So there have been key junctures where Germany's impetus and leadership has really made a significant impact. But going to the forward-looking aspect of that question, I think this is an opportunity for Germany to play a leadership role. I think in particular because Germany is closing this gap that had emerged in the last several years between its view or its hopes for a constructive partnership with Russia. Those hopes were dashed for many in 2014, although there were still some who held out some hope that a constructive future with Russia would be possible. And now Germany has moved much more in the direction of those skeptics in Central and Eastern Europe that were worried about the potential for Russia destabilizing Europe and trying to reverse the 30 years of post-Cold War political reality in Europe. So I think this is an opportunity. It depends a lot on how the German political parties and how the German political system overall incorporate the lessons of this this war. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, there's been a number of questions that are similar to this one. I'm just going to pose one from Mike Leonard. He says, has the rise in right-wing populism taken a political hit in Germany as a consequence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine? I think you've touched on that, obviously, in your conversation, but where do we see that going?
I think they have taken a hit, and I think they will continue because especially the far right, the AfD party, they have been the most vocal up until the war. They were always the most vocal supporters not just of ties with Russia, but of Putin personally. And apologists for the annexation of Crimea in some cases, and people who diminished any risk or threat from Russia to European security. And so every one of those statements, all of those positions are now turned against them. And it's pretty hard for them to deal with, in particular because in the AfD in Germany, like many other extreme right parties in Europe, have, it's been kind of a two-way street. On the one hand, they've cultivated relations with Russia because they have tried to elevate Vladimir Putin as sort of, as a conservative leader, as a leader of kind of a nation state oriented approach. In some cases, people have tried to argue that that Putin is a Christian leader who should, and that should be emulated in Europe. All these are ridiculous notions, but nevertheless, this has been what they've tried to do, and less so in the case of the AfD, but with other European far right parties, they have in some cases received financial support from Russian sources. So in the same way that this has been, so they are exposed and discredited by the naked violence and the brutality of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it's all being carried out by the leader that they had praised so effusively, and in the service of a kind of an outrageous attempt to redraw borders that is catastrophic for Ukraine and would be disastrous for Europe as a whole if that were the way European security would be structured for the future.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jeff and John, for this critical conversation. It certainly painted a more detailed picture of Germany's role in the world today. And
Well,
thank you to all the
Thank you,
students.
Jim.
And sure. And thank you to all the students who joined us this evening, to Kyle Morrison at NMC Educational Technologies, to all of our members and to future members, and especially to Stan Otto, who really put us in touch with Jeff initially. So thank you, Stan. And to Alex Tank of IAF for his work, of course, in helping to make tonight's event possible. So we ask you to please sign up if you have a chance for the IAF e-news at tciaf.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TCIAF. And hopefully join us next month when we host an engaging program on climate change with Dr. Rachel Licker, Principal Climate Scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So again, thank you very much for being with us this evening. And for all the IAF diplomat, envoy, and ambassador members, please join us in about 5 minutes for our leadership circle. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, John.
Great.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
And thanks to Stan. Thanks to Stan Otto. If you're out there, Stan, thanks again.